Myself, along with two other members in the room today, Madge Richardson and Dr. Hartley D'Entremont, interviewed Charles in 2012, I believe it was, for the position of CEO. I remember asking Charles why he wanted to work for NPI. And in typical Charles fashion, he said, "I don't know that I want to work for NPI." Well, he got the job, obviously, and I'm sure he's asked himself that several times over the past 6 years. Charles moved to Thunder Bay in 2013. He joined NPI after 12 years with the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. He has worked in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors as a program manager, policy analyst, senior administrator, consultant, and entrepreneur. Charles travels extensively throughout Northern Ontario and can routinely be found engaging with one of NPI's 780,000 bosses, people like you and I, the bosses of Northern Ontario. Whether at formal conferences, small workshop sessions, or one-on-one over coffee, Charles is passionate about listening to his fellow Northerners. Charles is the author of and firmly believes in NPI's tagline, evidence-based solutions for and from Northern Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Charles Cirtwill.
6 years in and I'm still not sure. All right, I'm going to try to use this correctly, and if it doesn't work, Christina's promised that she'll take over and keep me from making a mistake. First, thank you all for coming this morning. I apologize for the data-heavy slides you're about to experience. I'll try to translate them into English for you, but as Florence just demonstrated, numbers are tough, and that's the reason why these slides were put together by Alex Ross and there's Fen over there, Fen Lee. So any mistakes in the slides are their fault, and if you want to fight about the data, please see them afterwards, and they'll be happy to explain why you're wrong. It's interesting. It's great for me to have an opportunity to kind of come here and work in Northern Ontario. I said this yesterday at the conference. I said it last night at dinner. Looking at the young people in the North, I think we're in good hands going forward. It's interesting. Sometimes I doubt that observation because this morning, for example, all of the bright young minds that I work for were standing over, I told you I was going to make fun of you, standing over in front of this sign over here that advertises what's called the Northern Analyst Cooperative. It's an exercise that MPI put together about 1.5 years ago to allow us to share the bright young minds that we had in our offices with organizations, communities, not-for-profits who don't necessarily have the budget to have a full-time analyst on staff. And so they were looking at the sign and it says high-end skills and reasonable cost, and they said, hey, look, we're BMWs. So there you have it. That's the kind of sarcasm I have to deal with on a daily basis. Keeps you sharp. I want to highlight the fact that one of those words is in red. It says State of Ontario's Northern Regions. I try to say this as often as I possibly can and as many times in a public forum or in a material that's going to be repeated, because let's just say that there are folks who reside outside of Northern Ontario who aren't necessarily clear on this fact. Northern Ontario is not a single entity. There are significant differences between what's going on in Kenora, what's going on in the Sioux, what's going on in Sudbury, and there's certainly fundamental differences between those communities and what's going on in, say, Manitoulin, for example. And it's not that we don't have some similarities, but we have lots of differences as well. I like to call them market opportunities. We all have a different value proposition to put forward, but that means that the policy that impacts our region it has to be flexible. It can't be one size fit all. And you saw yesterday when Dave got up to talk at the microphone just how frustrating it can be saying that message over and over and over again for 27 years, did you say, Dave? And still having to say that message and still not necessarily being listened to on a regular basis. So that's kind of the theme, and that's why we've got that red word there. The bottom line is this. As a maritimer, I'm going to take a little bit of liberties with Great Big Sea and tell you we've not reached the end of the world as we know it, but we certainly should not be feeling fine. For those of you who don't know the words to that song, I'd encourage you to just Google Great Big Sea, and trust me, you'll figure it out. From an environmental perspective, we've got mixed results. From a social perspective, we continue to see progress. From a demographic perspective, as Dr. Antunes highlighted, we've got a big challenge, but we've also got a lot of opportunities, and we heard that yesterday. From an employment perspective, we continue to have solid numbers, particularly for youth, and then the growth of full-time jobs. This is a message we're not particularly good at communicating either to ourselves or outside the region. We're getting a little bit better, but we need to kind of continue to focus. On the economic side, we have a little bit of growth, fairly diverse economy still, and more service sector than goods-based sector, but it may not sound like the North that you hear in your stereotypical description of the North, but it is a common description of most modern economies. They're very switched over from making materials to actually delivering services. So the fact that our economy looks like that suggests that we're more in tune with the world than we may, or many others may assume. And of course, from an income perspective, many northern districts outperform the province. Let me say that slowly and again. Many northern districts outperform the province from the perspective of median income. So when people tell you you can't make a living here and that money doesn't go far enough, they're wrong on both counts. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the environmental indicators and how things are getting better. One of our challenges continue to be drinking water advisories, and Kayla was kind enough to outline this for us in great detail yesterday. You'll see that we have had great success in eliminating drinking water advisories. The blue line there indicates our success, but you'll see that the orange lines are still far too high. The orange lines are drinking water advisories that are still in place. And unfortunately, even while we're making progress, we continue to have problems arise. The gray lines there are new drinking water advisories in the last number of years. So we continue to make progress, more progress than we have, but we continue to see difficulties in some areas. On the emissions side, things are getting reasonably better. We're seeing progress across the board. We're decreasing in most census districts around average fine particulate matter output. So that means that we're doing better than we have in the past in terms of managing that. We're doing our fair share, I think, is probably a reasonable characterization, or at the very least, we're making progress. And that's the critical thing, is to continue to make progress. We talked about yesterday how we could possibly look at some advantages around making some profit on the progress that we're making, and I'm sure that we may see that accelerate over time. Perfect. So these are greenhouse gas emissions. So the first one deals with particulate matter that we're releasing into the air. This is greenhouse gas emissions, and you'll see that that from the perspective of Northern Ontario, we continue to outperform the rest of the region in terms of controlling those emissions. Now, that being said, they've made progress where we haven't, but then again, we were so low to begin with that perhaps it's much more difficult for us to see the kind of advances that they are experiencing. And again, that goes to this message, and I've heard Dave talk about this as the mayor of Kenora and as the head of NOMA. We get a lot of flack here in Northern Ontario around our natural resource industries and the sensitivity to the environment. These kind of measures indicate that not only are we experienced at dealing with natural resources and taking it out, but we're also very good at making sure that the overall impact is minimized, that we set a global standard in many cases for forestry, for mining, for green mining. And I think that's something, again, that we do a very bad job communicating to the rest of the world. Next slide, please. This is environmental engagement. Now, I'm not going to talk about the spike in 2015-ish, but I will highlight the fact that in CMA, so in Thunder Bay and in Sudbury, we consistently outperform the rest of the province and the rest of the country around environmental engagement on a volunteer basis. Much as I just described our industries being focused on being green, being progressive, being engaged with the environment, the people that live here are as well, and I think that's something that we should be proud of and continue to focus on. Next slide. This allows me to transition nicely into the next structure around social and economic characteristics of the North. You see charitable donations, and in particular in Thunder Bay and here in Algoma, you see that we consistently outperform both the province and the rest of the country. And that's good news. It means that not only are we worried about the environment, we're also worried about our fellow man, and that is something, again, to be proud of. A little bit weaker in the other districts, but not far short of the overall average. Next. Crime. From a social perspective, Florence talked about my interview at NPI, which happened in 2013, not 2012, but that's okay. I forgot that the board wasn't important until 2013, so Harley and I can talk about that later. In any event, the day I arrived in Thunder Bay for my job interview 6 years ago, the headline on the paper, the local paper, was Thunder Bay, murder capital of Canada. Now, if that's not an advertisement for encouraging somebody to move to your city, I'm not entirely sure what it would be. But the good news is crime is down. Crime is down across the board and across the districts. So these are the 3 northwestern districts. The next slide will show you the same trend in the other districts. We had a little bit of a spike in Manitoulin district, but that has significantly dropped in the last number of years, and so it's going in the right direction. Let's talk about education. Education, you see that here we're looking at increase in college and university attainment. This is the Northwest, and you see we're looking at 2006 through to 2016. The good news is that while we continue to have a higher than average number of folks without some form of college or university, those numbers continue to rise, and we see a significant reduction in the number of people who have no college or university at all. Certainly our colleges in particular have done a good job of responding to the skills upgrades and the skill needs of our Indigenous population in particular, but some of our workforce in transition, particularly in the forest industry. So that's a good message to carry forward. Let's take a look at the Northeast and see how they're doing. Northeast is the same trend. You see, in fact, a much higher spike on the college side. So again, here in Algoma, in North Bay, in Timmins, you're seeing that positive result as those organizations recognize that reaching out to those underserved populations are in their interest and in the community's interest. So the bridge is strong, Dr. Antunes, and it is leading to a much stronger and more robust communities. Let's talk about age projection, shall we? So this is one of those wonderful little diagrams that demographers love. For those of you who are not demographers, I'll explain to you the ideal shape of this thing. So the closer it is to the pyramid, the more sustainable your community is. And by that means there's lots of children, lots of people in the working age who are doing jobs, earning money, paying taxes so that you can deliver the services. And a robust but not necessarily overwhelming number of folks who are in their retirement ages who are taking and consuming healthcare services. As you can see, a few years ago we were sort of pyramid-like. We had the bubble in the middle, much as every other community does around the baby boom. Unfortunately, as you look forward into our projections, we're becoming a rectangle, and in fact, as you project that even forward, we become an inverted pyramid. Now, everybody knows what happens to an inverted pyramid, right? It falls down, and that's why we need to be very concerned about the thing that Dr. Antunes highlighted for us this morning, which is around that population demographic shift and the fact that we do need to see a significant change in some of these trend lines. Let's go to the next one. These are age projections, percentage of working age population, 2001 to 2041. So you'll see that our inverted pyramid was drawn about midway through this graph, and things are not getting better in any of the jurisdictions that we're looking at here. And I think this is Ontario. Northeastern Ontario is the red, and Northwestern Ontario is the green. So stabilizes a little bit higher in the Northwest, but no indication from our projections currently that those numbers are going in the right direction, which is upwards, except in one very clear exception, and that is the next slide. Indigenous population. The Indigenous population in Northern Ontario, both Northwest and Northeast, and in all the districts except for in all the districts. The Indigenous population is growing, it's younger, and the challenge we have in that area is not so much around population support, aging support, understanding the demographic trends. It's addressing the social and economic history or the social and economic conditions that have been created by the history that we all heard about yesterday from Kayla. There is no question that we need to move forward on that in an expeditious way. As I highlighted with the drinking water advisory and some of the other indications around education, we are making progress, but not nearly fast enough. And continued investments and continued efforts by individuals and organizations are required. Let's try the next slide. That being said, if we had put in our normal demographic dependency ratio slides, DDR is a measure that says whether or not your community is sustainable. It talks about the percentage of people who are working versus the percentage of people who require support. So that's people over 65 and under 15. If we put those slides up here, what it would tell you is that even if we solved every problem in every First Nation community in the North tomorrow, even if we solved every under-engaged and under-supported challenge for people with physical and mental difficulties, with people who are going through workplace transition, we would still not have enough people in 3 to 5 years to sustain our economies as we know it. So our communities would continue to get smaller, you would see high levels of urbanization, and you would see a gutting out of many of our services. We are already experiencing that in most of our small communities outside the 5 or the 6 big urban centers, and we're seeing it in the urban centers themselves. Personal support workers are remarkably difficult to find anywhere in Northern Ontario. Physicians continue to be a challenge despite the huge success that Northern Ontario School of Medicine has been. Truck drivers, retailers, people in the cultural and tourism industries. So we heard yesterday about the huge opportunities Indigenous tourism has for the potential to create income and make communities sustainable. But the simple fact is, and Kevin highlighted this yesterday, they don't have enough people to fill the jobs, to create the expertise, or to go get training to kind of be able to deliver the services. And that will be an ongoing issue, which means that we need more people. And so you get into a migration indication, and what you see here is the increase in net migration in the Northwest. And the good news is that in the last several years, we've seen a positive uptick. We're getting to the point where migration is finally on a net positive as opposed to net negative basis. The message is getting out there to our children that there are jobs here for them. And that's a really good news. And that news is now getting out to the GTA, where people who are unhappy with their choice of living in a large urban center and are looking for an alternative are coming here in increasing numbers. Let's take a look at the Northeast. The Northeast spike is even higher. So folks like Al McDonald out of North Bay, Christian Provenzano here and their teams, the folks in Sudbury are having success. They've been down, sending the message over and over and over again for the last 5 years that this is a great place to come, raise your family, grow, own a business, and it's working. The key for us now is we need to accelerate this process. We need to double, triple, and quadruple those numbers, recognizing, of course, that we still have to be careful, as Elder Roach reminded us very eloquently yesterday. And so when you look at things like the rural and northern immigration pilot, you see the target numbers are very small. We're talking about 200, 250 people per community. We're talking about screening processes. We're talking about making sure these are people who are going to enjoy moving to our communities and will want to stay here with their families. And I think that's the key thing, is we want to make sure that those who come understand our communities, want to participate in our communities, are looking for a true partnership with our First Nations and other communities in the North. Let's move on to the next slide. So migration is net totals, domestic and foreign population. Immigration is the numbers of study permit holders. So this talks about the impact of foreign students coming to our shores. You see that in Greater Sudbury there's been a huge spike, Thunder Bay, North Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, and you're even starting to see numbers show up in Timiskaming Shores and in Timmins. Our organizations are doing a good job of drawing these folks in, and we heard yesterday or the day before, I believe, at the Immigration Forum, talking about a great success. No, it was the day before, Stacey, because it was you who told the story. We've had some international students studied at Confederation College. They graduated. They went to Terrace Bay, opened an Indian restaurant. It had huge success in a small community, and now they've opened a second in Thunder Bay. This is the kind of success story we're talking about from a perspective of international students coming, learning a skill set that they're interested in learning, and then applying that skill set here in our communities. Let's go to the next slide. Retention rates are a problem everywhere except in Manitoba in this country and the three major centers. So Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto continue to have high retention rates. The province of Manitoba, particularly in its rural centers, outperforms all the rest of us in terms of being able to hang on to people. And you'll see from a perspective of retention after 1 year that we continue to have problems here. That to a certain extent, the folks that we've been attracting over the last number of years haven't quite necessarily been the fit that we would like to see, and we're seeing them depart at numbers higher than our ideal. However, there is good news. Let's go to the next slide. On the next slide, you see retention after 3 years. And we're not only stable, we actually saw an increase in retention over 3 years. So in other words, if we can get them to stay past that 12 to 14 month period, they're staying for a while. They're finding partners, they're finding areas of interest, they're finding communities that have exciting education or entertainment opportunities, exciting cultural trends. They are finding places where they want to raise their children, open businesses, and build their careers. So that's good news for us. Labor force. Labor force since 2008, we're getting back to some bad news. So you can see how I'm doing the good news, bad news sandwich kind of thing. We'll try and end on a positive note. Trust me, since I've seen what Alex and Fen want me to say, we will end on a positive note. Whether they intended that or not, I'm going to interpret it as positive. Labor force since 2008 is bad news. You see unemployment actually is pretty good. We're fairly stable, and in fact, we're going down. This is an important message that consistently falling in the Northwest and the Northeast, and we're looking at a return now in the Northeast to 2008 levels, and in fact, in the Northwest, we've been below those and consistently below those, and consistently better than the province as a whole for a number of years now. Go to the next slide. You look at Northeastern Ontario slowly closing the gap, nearly on par with Ontario in terms of full-time employment. Remember that one of the things we're seeing globally, and particularly in Western economies, is the rise of what's called perilous employment. That's not the word I'm looking for. Precarious employment. Thank you, Stacy. So precarious employment means you've got for those of us who remember a time when you were hired by a company or by the government, you stayed for 45 or 50 years and then you retired with a pension, that's no longer the reality for the vast majority of folks. And that is the case across the board. But the good news here in Northern Ontario, and in particular in Northeastern Ontario, is that from a perspective of the creation of full-time as opposed to part-time jobs, we're doing better than the rest of the province. Again, a message that we're not so good at communicating outside of rooms like this. Let's look at the youth unemployment numbers. Again, higher youth employment in both the Northeast and the Northwest and has been increasing since 2011. Again, a message that we say over and over again. In fact, I would suggest that whoever's in Sudbury should track down Tomas over there and have him do a video and talk about the fact that in 3 years he's gone from an internship placement to a contract job. He's now the executive director of a pan-northern agency. Those are the kind of opportunities for bright young people in Northern Ontario, and that's the kind of message we need to get out to folks. Next slide. This is a bad news piece. We've got a lower percentage of self-employed people in Northern Ontario. The entrepreneurs that we saw last night at the Northern Ontario Business Awards continue to be the exception, not the rule. And we need to do a better job of seeing those folks get supported, seeing new ideas and creative ideas moving forward in the region. We have to get a little bit more comfortable with failure because the simple fact is that sometimes great ideas, even well-executed great ideas, aren't necessarily going to pan out the first time. So that's a challenge. It's a cultural issue to a certain extent. We heard Heather Hall, Dr. Heather Hall, yesterday talk about teaching people how to be entrepreneurs. I have to admit, having come from an entrepreneurial family, having gone through the ups and downs of businesses having huge success and then 2 years later folding, I'm not entirely sure we can teach those skills. But I'm willing to try. And I'm willing to see the evidence that carries forward. But I can say what I know for sure coming out of Atlantic Canada around mentorship and entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurs getting together with each other, that's the way that you create and encourage entrepreneurs. I'm not entirely sure in a classroom environment we can teach those kind of risk-taking proclivities that are required for successful entrepreneurs. But in some way, shape, or form, we have to make this part of our culture. We have to support those who are prepared to go elsewhere. So perhaps instead of Sault Ste. Marie pitching the folks in Bombardier who are now finding themselves in transition to come to Sault Ste. Marie and take on another job for another big company, we should take a page out of the model of Bell Alliant in Atlantic Canada and support the people who are now out of work to create and innovate and grow a new cluster. Bell, for those of you who are not Maritimers, I'll give you a little bit of story. Bell had a huge kind of amalgamation among the three provinces, saw thousands of people laid off, and what ended up happening is large numbers of those folks turned into entrepreneurs, and they essentially created an ICT economy in the region that now sees Halifax growing at a rate of somewhere between 6 and 10% a year. That's the kind of innovation and creativity that we might want to take a look at encouraging. Now let's move to the economy. So location quotients greater than 1 indicate a higher concentration in that industry than the province. Did you follow all that? That was data speak for basically the longer the line is, the more you're going to see that industry concentrated in your region. And the basic message is, if you want a diverse economy, you want to have a nice medium-sized line for as many of these industries as possible. And if I interpret that wrongly, you guys can tell me later. But basically, you look at this map, and what you see is public administration, other services, accommodation, healthcare, education services, transportation, and warehousing. They're reasonably well distributed. They're reasonably comparable to the rest. The only huge focus we see, and it's not a surprise to any of us, is in the natural resource industry. But even in that sector, we've seen a little bit of a growth in terms of higher concentration, which suggests both that we're once again a little too focused in that area, but also we're seeing an expansion in that area. So there's good news, bad news in the expansion of those lines. But this is a message, again, that we really fail to get across. The economy in Northern Ontario is far more diverse than we think it is, and certainly far more diverse than the people in the GTA think it is. And that's a message that we need to kind of reinforce and send out, and that's why I'm so excited about efforts like the RNIP, efforts like Come Study North, and those types of things, because we're sending the right message, and we're getting better at it. So we have understanding our weaknesses and our strengths, and we're much better at communicating than we have been in the past. Let's look at the Northeast. So again, it's the same sort of exercise. You do see a higher concentration in some industries in the Northeast over the Northwest. Again, on the side of healthcare in particular, there's a lot of concentration. So you'd see the major hospitals in North Bay and Sudbury, for example, would see that. And again, you've got that large side on the forestry, fishing, mining, quarrying, oil and gas. So again, it's not a surprise. The exciting thing is you're seeing agriculture appear on that map, and that's a good news story. It's one of those, former federal minister Joe Oliver had a piece in the paper a couple weeks ago, and he got lambasted for it. But basically, what he was saying is that there are opportunities to profit from climate change and responses to climate change. He said it in a typically conservative way, which means very badly. But in any event, the message was an appropriate one, and it was one we heard yesterday from Peter Bruins, that there are areas that opportunities are going to be created for us in terms of the response. One of those being high wood buildings, one of those potentially being the replacement of single-use plastic bags with paper bags again, and another one being the agricultural sector. We're seeing those farmers move from the environs of the GTA into better areas like Temiskaming Shores and elsewhere. Let's talk a little bit about building permits. By the way, if I'm running long on time, it's my team's fault because they took away my clock, so I don't know how well I'm doing. So if I keep you here longer, I apologize, but it's all Chrissy's fault. From a building permits perspective, you'll see the green area, that's government building. So that tends to be counter-cyclical. I'm getting an evil eye as she walks out of the room, for those of you who can't see her. I'll pay for that joke later, of course I will. But in any event, building permits, you see the green is counter-cyclical, so that's an indication where the government responds to a downturn in the economy. So they build things like hospitals, universities, roads, et cetera, et cetera. The good news, The good news, I guess, is that they don't feel the need to pour a bunch of money into the region, which suggests that the private sector economy is doing well. Of course, if you're a contractor who likes likes to build hospitals, roads, and the type of thing, yeah, it's bad news because there's not quite so much money flowing around for those types of exercises. And overall, the total non-residential spend is trending downward, and we'd like to see that kind of go up. But again, that's a factor more of the global economy and opportunities and taking advantage of it than it is of anything kind of weakness in our overall economy. Let's take a look at the building permits in the Northeast. Same sort of exercise, but the good news in the Northeast in particular is you see that commercial and industrial continue to be fairly robust spending. So whereas private spending in the Northwest is kind of trending downward slightly and pretty stable, in the Northeast you're seeing a little bit of growth, a little bit of decline in the last year, but still much higher numbers overall, and something to go from. Next slide. This is the good news, and this has been trending down for a number of years. This is the number of business bankruptcies. So when you see a kind of recession, we do tend to see a spike in bankruptcies as the weaker companies shut down. The good news is that we're seeing that stabilize, and the idea being that we're at the point now where we're not necessarily worried about losing large numbers of our companies in the throes of that kind of economic up and down. Of course, one of the reasons that the overall trend is so low is because the number of entrepreneurs continue to be so low. So you'd expect a higher level of bankruptcies in an economy where you're seeing a lot of churn, where you're seeing a lot of people experiment with new ideas, run into trouble, find another new idea, chase that. So to a certain extent, I'm going to say this in a weird way, a reasonable number of bankruptcies is actually a good thing for your economy. So it's a challenge around kind of balancing too big a spike in bankruptcies with too few. What you don't want is a stable economy where everybody's happy and no one's experimenting with something new, because there's not a lot of growth opportunities in that. Business counts. Business counts, and this looks at goods producing, and you'll see that I've circled a couple of high points. For the most part, our business counts have been stable. Stable is good, particularly in a time when you've got some transition happening, or you've got economic situations where, for example, our major industries, the clock is back. Oh my. Welcome to my world, everybody. In any event, the business counts are good, and you actually see a little bit of growth in Parry Sound, Manitoulin, and Rainy River. Again, mostly the business counts you're seeing in that sector are around those service industries. In particular, you're seeing a little bit of growth in areas like consulting, business management, cultural industries. We've done really well in the last number of years opening up breweries and distilleries, so yay for us. I still haven't sampled them all, but I plan on it, and so should you, and spend as much money as you can at the hotels along the way. Let's take a look at the business counts for service-producing industries. And again, you see here, much like goods-producing industries, the service sector is very stable. Again, this is both good news and bad news in that we see a sound foundation to build from, but we would like to see a little bit more growth. And hopefully, as we see some of the opportunities that Peter and others talked about yesterday bearing fruit, we'll see these numbers start to grow. Next slide. So you remember how I told you that we outperformed the rest of the province in terms of income? Well, here's that slide. This is medium income, full-time, full-year medium employment income 2016. The purple line at the top is the country, and the green line below it is the province, and you'll see good news for many of our districts in that we are above that line, above the provincial line in Nipissing, in Parry Sound for Francophones, in Manitoulin for Francophones, in Sudbury, Greater Sudbury, Cochrane for Thunder Bay. This is good news across the board for many large segments of our population, including the Indigenous population, which is the green line there. You'll see at or above the provincial line in Sudbury, Greater Sudbury, Temiskaming, Cochrane, Algoma is at the line. This is good news. It means that the businesses and the jobs that these communities are finding, that these individuals are finding, not only are full-time, as I told you a few slides ago, but also reasonably well-paying, at least compared to our friends in Southern Ontario. And that means it's easier to transition out of social and economic challenges for those who are here, and it's easier to attract new people when we can tell them not only can you afford a house here, but you can get a job where you're earning the same level of income as you are elsewhere. Let's look at income composition. Income composition continues to be a little bit of a problem for us. If you look left to right, in Southern Ontario, work income, which is the blue, tends to be a little bit higher by a couple points over the Northwest, and then a couple points more over the Northeast. We're talking about percentage points. I would like to see that inverted, so I'd like to be 2 points ahead instead of 2 points behind, but the fact that we're at or near those performance levels suggests that the income that I indicated earlier is having a positive impact. We're less dependent to a certain extent on the government than we have been in our recent past. Let's look at income composition. Market incomes based on the highest proportion of income, Cochrane, Sudbury, Greater Sudbury, and Kenora districts. You see they are the areas where the growth is happening and where, compared to the other districts in the north, you're seeing higher levels. Really, it's only in Manitoulin that we have a significant challenge around employment income versus support and transfers from government and elsewhere. But again, those numbers are going up mostly across the board, and that's the good news to take out of this slide. Last two slides for those of you who are eager to get out of here. This is a fun slide. It's got a lot of information on it, and then I made them add more. So if you find it confusing, this one's my fault. What this looks at is the total gender earnings gap, and it's a comparison of both participation in the economy and income. So in an ideal world, all of us would be in the far right-hand top corner of this graph. And you'll see my big red circle, and you'll notice that it's empty. That's unfortunate, but that is our reality. That being said, those two dotted lines are the province of Ontario. And so compared to the rest of the province, if your community is on here, you either want to be above the horizontal line or to the right of the vertical line. And so you look at communities like Manitoulin, which is well above those lines. You look at Kenora, and then you look at areas who are both above that line and to the right. So that means that their participation levels for women and their income levels for women are more comparable to the males in their regions. That's good news. It means our economy is more balanced. It's got a participation and an income level that's comparable for female and male. It's not perfect. As I said, the ideal world, we're all over on the far right-hand side, but we're doing better than many other jurisdictions, and we're making progress. The red dots are 2001, the blue dots are 2016, and the good news is the vast majority of our communities have both moved up and moved to the right. In other words, the gap between women and men is closing, income-wise and participation-wise, across the north. To the next slide. Manitoulin has a higher female income and participation rate for Indigenous persons. So what we did is we said, okay, we looked at the overall population, we looked at the closing gaps between men and women. What about for our Indigenous population? Is it any different? And again, the good news is you look at my big red circle, which in an ideal world some of us would be in, and lo and behold, you find Manitoulin. So from the perspective of the District of Manitoulin, what you're finding is that women are getting jobs at relatively the same level, or participating in the economy at relatively the same level as males in the Indigenous population, and they're getting paid at a similar basis. That's good news. The rest of us, if you look at that horizontal and vertical line again, comparing us to the province, unfortunately, in some of our jurisdictions, we're below and to the left of the province. In other words, we're underperforming in the Indigenous population among the participation of the female population, both in terms of participating in the economy and in terms of pay rates. So if there were policy responses that we wanted to target that would have larger impacts on our overall economic performance, participation and income for female Indigenous peoples is one of those areas that we should continue to focus on and a greater investment in. So I told you I was going to end on a positive note, and I tried, but I ended up getting the last bad message in there. But again, let me highlight on this slide, just as in the last slide, Comparatively speaking, 2001 to 2016, we are seeing the majority of those dots move up and to the right. In other words, we are making progress in terms of the income gap and the participation gap between male and females among our Indigenous population. And in fact, in some cases, the progress is significantly better than in the overall population as a whole. So we have identified this. We have done responses to this over the last decade. They are working. So it's just a simple exercise in recognizing that they're working, scaling them up, and expanding them into areas where they're not currently reaching. And on that note, we'll go to my favorite slide. Thank you, merci, miigwech. Means that I get to stop talking, except that I get to take and answer questions. Thank you all for your patience in listening. I noticed some of you actually took pictures of the slides. It's always fun for me to see that happening because it means that Alex and Fen are doing a great job. So does anybody have any questions?
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned agriculture is a success story in the north. You mentioned it could be related to climate change. My question is, could it be related instead to prices of land becoming more expensive in southern Ontario?
I think it's connected to both, and I think you're right. The reason that people are taking advantage of some of the changes in climate, and of course the investment that we've made, NOHFC has made in tiling, in other words, taking the water off the land so you can actually grow stuff there, is because of the land constraints in the GTA and the rising cost. It simply is a lot more profitable to sell your farm to a developer than it is to continue to farm in southern Ontario. And so you're seeing movement of early movers, particularly in the Amish and communities around northeastern Ontario, Timiskaming Shores, and in northwestern Ontario, particularly in the Rainy River District. So it's not just the cost of land in the GTA, it's also the cost of land in and around Winnipeg that's driving that change. But it's also the fact that we're seeing our growing seasons lengthen, so we're kind of coming at it from both sides. It's expensive on one side, and the economic opportunity to deliver profit is being expanded on the other side. So it's a nice balance. No comments, Stacy. No.
No more questions? I was going to make a comment, but I'm going to stand. So I just wanted to say, so I'm Stacy. Hi, everybody. And Charles mentioned my name a couple times.
I'm in the Phil Donahue show all of a sudden.
Now it's my show. No, I'm kidding. So I'm responsible for the Northwestern Ontario Local Immigration Partnership. And I've said this before in smaller groups, but I'm going to say it right now. There's no way, in my opinion, that local immigration partnerships throughout the North could do their job effectively without the work of the Northern Policy Institute. So, and I'm assuming that the RESO would probably say the same thing. Tama is nodding. I mean, you heard all this data, and how could I possibly go and have meaningful conversations with employers, people that perhaps aren't woke or just haven't had the opportunity to have the information without this work? So I'm so incredibly grateful to Charles and his team, because he's very generous with his team. He's like, oh yeah, we're going to do this, but don't tell Chrissy. So I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Don't tell Chrissy wasn't clear. She's standing right there.
You know I was going to tell her anyways. It's just in an act of transparency. So I just wanted to say, thank you on behalf of me, but I think also the rest of the lips I think are gone. But thank you so much, because I truly couldn't do my job without you, and very grateful. And I can't do much. I can support you in your fundraisers. I could try and help you whenever you can, but I just wanted to say thank you.
Well, before Al takes over, I will reciprocate in saying that we have wonderful partners, and the success that MPI has had in the last 6 years wouldn't be possible without organizations like the Local Immigration Partnership, or Madge Richardson, who's sitting there quietly, has been one of our most stable and reliable partners all through this. Much of the data you see here is the result of partnerships with Madge and the other workforce planning boards across the region, and we are blessed by the partners that we have across the North. And while my finance department might not necessarily be enthusiastic about me sharing staff, the team loves working with our partners. I think that's fair to say. There you go. Mayor Al.
Charles, thanks very much for your presentation. I just want to say the City of North Bay is really behind your organization. We think you do great work for Northern Ontario, so thank you. And also thank you for recognizing North Bay and the Sioux when it comes to the immigration. We recognize that's the way we're going to be sustainable and grow into the future. One of the things that we're doing from an Invest North Bay perspective is next month we're going to launch a campaign. We're actually going to go into the GTA and target immigrants to try to get them north. So we know that there's about 106,000 new immigrants go to Toronto, and Toronto would not be growing either without immigration. So I hope you continue to encourage northern leaders to adopt immigration as probably one of their number one priorities for future sustainability. Here's my question, and it's a little bit political. So we know that the government of Ontario, or the provincial government, has a good percentage, or if not most, employees in the most expensive area code in Canada. What is the organization's perspective on decentralizing government and maybe having some of those government jobs move north?
Okay. You're not going to like my answer, Al. I apologize in advance. So that's the Peterson Promise is what we're talking about. We're talking about moving public services outside of the GTA. I've been a policy analyst for 25 years. I've gone through that trend in 3 provinces, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And the harsh reality of the numbers is that from an efficiency perspective, it's remarkably costly for them to do that. And they end up losing staff, core staff, long-term memory. And so in many cases, they'll start to feel the pain and stop it relatively quickly. And Peterson Promise is a perfect example of that situation. The other challenge, of course, is that many of the public servants in the GTA are policy research, data and analysis branches, all of whom benefit from being close proximity to politicians. So pulling out my political scientist hat for a second or two, and I did a lot of work on org design early in my career, there are challenges to being away from the center of decision making if you're a deputy or an assistant deputy and their support staff. So to a certain extent, having that policy branch in proximity to the decision makers on a regular basis, you can't beat it in terms of the overall influence of your organization. If you talk to, for example, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans federally, who tried that model back in the late 80s, early 90s, they very quickly discovered that their influence at the cabinet table declined significantly and very quickly reversed. That being said, there are lots of line departments, organizations, delivery agencies that do not need to be in the GTA. Central processing, accounting, payroll exercises, all those kind of things. And the federal government is a perfect example. They put the GST processing center in Prince Edward Island. They've got the tax center in Manitoba. That kind of stuff works, and it can be accelerated and expedited. And you're right, it does save their staff money because they're not paying $10,000 or $1,000 a month for a 900 square foot apartment. They can actually get a house. So there are opportunities. They're not necessarily as big as some of us would like them to see, but there's no question that that transition could take place. That being said, to a certain extent, some of it already has. If you take a look in many of our communities, there's large numbers of public servants delivering line services here, but there are opportunities for greater expansion. For those of us who like low tax bills, there's a transitional cost. So we should recognize, and if the provincial government of any stripe decided to undertake it, one of the things that if I was giving them advice, I'd encourage them to do is budget for that early cost in those first couple of years. There's going to be people who don't want to take the jobs. They'll use their seniority to bump other people out. There'll be transitional allowances, travel allowances that will spike. But overall, it can be done, but generally only in certain portions of the overall government. So I gave you a mixed answer. I was going to go totally negative, but I figured I'd find some silver lining in the cloud. There was something you said that I wanted to highlight, and now I forgot it, so I'll try and remember as we go along. Oh, the marketing of the North in the GTA or GTAH is a huge opportunity for us. And I would suggest not just for newcomers, i.e. immigrants from outside of Canada, but also Canadians living in the GTA or folks who have been in the GTA 6 to 7 years. But it's also an opportunity for the provincial Indigenous population who are residing in Toronto and having challenges. And so to the extent that we can demonstrate that there are culturally sensitive economic opportunities and supportive communities in the North, where instead of living in the GTA and having negative experiences on a daily basis, you can come and be welcomed and supported. That's another population that we shouldn't forget in terms of relocation and creating opportunities for them in our communities. And that applies whether those First Nations are from Ontario or from other jurisdictions and have just found themselves in the GTA. The other positive thing I'll note is this. There's a fellow by the name of Mike Moffat who's done some work around departures from the GTA the last number of years. Consistently, it's been about 30,000 people have left the GTA on an annual basis. That number spiked to 50,000 in the last couple of years, and it's sustained itself at that level. So we're talking about an opportunity that basically has doubled in the last 2 or 3 years. People are tired of living in pods. And so I think you're going to find a welcoming audience when you get down there, and hopefully we'll see that continue to grow.
Dave Farrell from Thunder Bay, North Superior Workforce Planning Board. My question, Charles, is the government currently is looking at new ways of supplying the funds to our region, both through health, employment, apprenticeship. Any comments on the impact that will have on our regions?
Every government loves to redesign the way they spend money so that they can say they're spending on priority areas, and really all they're doing is to use an unfortunate phrase, realigning the chairs in the Titanic. I'm not so fussed over the end result. I think that in the end, regardless of the process they use, the metrics to assess it will still be funding by population, funding by need, overall results. I just worry about the transition period. A lot of time, energy, and resources will be distracted while we decide that this strategy is better than the strategy that those guys before us came up with and the girls before them came up with. In many cases, you end up with a different name for the same process. As I said, my specialty early on in my career was org design. I can think of 4 different themes around the federal public service, one of which sticks in my mind was La Relève. It was the same exercise. We're going to refresh the federal public service. We're going to change the way we do things. We're going to go from envelopes to this, to that, to the other thing. And in the end of the day, they kept, for the most part, the same administrative processes, just spent a lot of time and energy on new letterhead. From the perspective of, will it impact services in the North? No question. Will it be disruptive for the next year and a half? Absolutely. At the end of the day, just before the next provincial election, will it be roughly the same as it was before the last provincial election? Probably. Anthony really wants to give the microphone away, but seeing no hands, I'm going to escape from the podium, going once, going twice. Sault, thank you all again for joining us this morning. Thank you for your support of the Institute. And I will remind you that these kind of sessions, both in terms of raising funds for the Institute, which are absolutely critical, but also getting your ideas. So by all means, if you're on your way home and you think of something, send us a text, send us an email, send us a letter. Yes, the Postal Service still works. We've got a friend here in Sault Ste. Marie named Hal McGonigal who's proof of that. He continues to send us stuff by the mail, and it gets to us amazingly. So by all means, please continue the conversation afterwards. Staff and board are in the room here if you want to meet with them, but otherwise, you have a great day, and for those of you traveling, safe travels.